So, Alexander, welcome to CTO Confessions. It's great to have you on board, sir.
Yeah, it's a pleasure for me to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Brilliant, brilliant. So tell the audience a little bit about yourself. Who are you? What do you do? And who do you work for?
Yeah, of course. Alexandre Goedert. I am a software developer from Brazil that later became a technical manager. And within this world of tech management, I played different roles. So I first started as head of technology when I worked for ThoughtWorks. That is an American consultancy firm. And then I'm now in this role called VP of Engineering for SurePay. So I have a background in computer science, software development, and then later I was like gradually becoming more of a technical manager.
Wow, that's great. I imagine it's been a fun journey, but is it something where you wanted to end up?
Yeah, it's a good question. It was not planned, to be honest. So as I was becoming, let's say, more senior as a developer, at some point of my career, I happened to be, let's say, the most senior developer in Chile. I was living in Chile at that point in time in Santiago, and I've been invited to start playing this role that is called head of technology in ThoughtWorks, right? So oftentimes I presented myself as the regional CTO for clients, so it was a similar role to a CTO. But no, it wasn't planned. So it was an interesting decision point. I decided to take it. I didn't change my job immediately, so I was still doing like a, let's say, part-time tech lead development role and part-time head of technology. But yeah, then I had to learn how to become a tech manager. It's a very different mindset.
It is, absolutely. It is. It is. I've transitioned from various kind of career points. I used to be a software engineer, electronics engineer as well. And there is a lot, there's a lot of letting go and a lot of embracing new things. So I'd sympathize with your journey. So in the industry that you're in at the moment, I think a lot of what you do is instant payments. And and there's this thing called IPR, which is the kind of regulation around it, instant payment regulations. I'm just curious to why this matters. What's the kind of importance of this aspect of the work that you do?
Yeah, well, so as we'll like to say, SurePay, so instant payment equals to equal instant fraud. What happened in case of SurePay? So the company started inside Rabobank as one of the big banks in the Netherlands, and it became like a spin-off of Rabobank. So Rabobank had this like let's say innovation department where they were experimenting with this service they called IBAN name check. So then here in the Netherlands, it's pretty common. So if you have your banking app, you're going to transfer money to someone. You put your account identification, that is an IBAN number. You put the account holder name, and then we provide an API that is doing the match between these two. It can return a match, a no match, or a close match. So that's in a nutshell, what the API does. In practice, it's way more complicated because we have many different countries in Europe, and countries, they have different banking networks, different banking institutions. We have SWIFT, for example. So it's complicated, but yeah, I think it's very important from a fraud prevention perspective. So this whole thing started in around 2017, but then recently it became mandatory. So first in the UK, so last year we had a lot of work in the UK to make all banks and PSPs compliant with that regulation. And this year it was the time of the European region. So yeah, we're very busy actually this week as we speak, implementing and doing the rollout of the European part.
Wow. Okay. And being a software engineer and being a big tester, I used to love testing because I like to really have a warm fuzzy feeling that when I was going to deploy some software in my world, which was embedded systems, knowing that it was going to work. What's the kind of testing kind of regime around this to make sure that the regulations are a tick, and also the sheer volume of traffic, I can imagine, is huge.
Yeah, it's an interesting challenge. So I think there's the first perspective of the matching algorithm itself, because so it's very hard to have an agreement among different banks and among different countries. So there's one. So there's the European Payment Council that dictates how you should do these things, but there are many different ways to interpret these rules, right? So what happens in practice is that we have a lot of sessions with our clients, with the banks. Sometimes we have groups of banks per country, and then we discuss with them, and then we make agreements. And then once we have these agreements, we have let's say an implementation roadmap. We also try to incorporate automated tests as much as possible. But yeah, it's a lot of discussion, and that's the first part, right? So that's the matching algorithm, and then we have a lot of work around integrations. So we have so because we work with banks, there's a lot of security concerns about the implementation that we do. So think about encryption, certificates. We have to rotate the certificates. So we need to encrypt in transit, at rest. So yeah, there's a lot of work related to that as well.
Yeah, wow, that's great. And on that note, I imagine my discussions with various people in banking and finance is that there's a lot of legacy systems kicking around as well.
Yeah, always. I think SurePay is not that old as a company, but we already have our own legacy, of course. Um, and I think, yeah, I think legacy and tech debt is always an important topic. And I think especially when you are still a startup or scale up, because initially you just need to prove that your product works, right? And that it can generate revenue and even profit. At some point in time when you just scale up, you need to start making it more stable, and then you cannot just add on top of it. So I think we are in this interesting stage where we are making all the systems more robust, right? But we had a very big growth phase until here. So we're starting to shift gears into like investing more on the foundational aspects of the software.
Yeah, I can imagine a company like, SurePay has got this real advantage in terms of because it is quite a new company, relatively speaking, to a lot of the players that have been around for a long time. They've got legacy systems for sure, and there's probably bits of code that you don't even look at, because if you look at it, it'll kind of not work. I don't know. But how did the company get into that space? I can imagine it's a difficult market to get your wedge in and then open up an opportunity.
Yeah, I think it's not easy, of course, especially because a very highly regulated market, right? When we talk with like all these big banks and PSPs, but I think it helped a lot the fact that it started in Rabobank, so it's one of the major banks in the Netherlands. I think that yeah, it gave us some credibility when we started, but also the nature of the service is we just connected dots between many different banks, and that means you sent me a request, I forward this request to the bank. It can be in the form of an API, or the bank can give the data if they don't have an API, and then we have to orchestrate this across all the participants. So when we start, it's hard because we don't have the data, we don't have the API connections, but as we started to get more clients, then this effect of this network became more interesting, right? So nowadays we are processing. So we have almost all the banks in the Netherlands. We have many banks in Belgium, in the UK, and in Ireland. So then this network effect becomes more interesting.
Yeah, fantastic. I've got an urge. I've got an urge to ask you about a confession, because being CTO confessions, what tech leader confessions have you got that you'd like to share with our audience here?
Yeah. So, well, the first one, I'm not a CTO, as I told you, right? So I'm a VP of engineering. I think it's to me doesn't really matter that much. I mean, it's every tech manager. I mean, depends a lot on the size of the company and what you're doing, and then you might have different names, right? So, but yeah, officially, I'm not a CTO. So I think that's the first one. Let me see what other confession I can make. I think it's fair to say I'm a bit annoyed with all this Gen AI hype that is happening nowadays. I mean, I like it to a great extent, but also I feel that there is a lot of people just like having very high expectations about the technology without really understanding what can be done with it and how it works, right? So yeah, I see this rush. I mean, almost all CEOs nowadays they want to get more like productivity out of the tooling, and I understand why. So everyone is talking about that, right? But I think in practice, what I see is first of all, there's a learning curve, right? So these tools are new, and even for software developers, you need to learn how to interact with them. It's not just about making questions, but I see people are learning how to actually craft prompts to different tasks. Right? It can be like you're coding, you're writing tests, or you're trying to create a new architecture piece. So, and then you have to fine tune these prompts. But it's not really about just getting the answer, because hallucination is there by design. So and then you need to be very precise on what you ask. And what I see from many developers nowadays is they prefer more to have like a guided process where they guide the AI or the tool about what they want to get out of it, and then this becomes more like, let's say, trustworthy in terms of results. So I think it's an agreement when I talk to the developers that all of them see some efficiency gains, but it's not as high as people expect, right? Because it's still something new. You have to learn how to do it. So, so yeah, I have mixed feelings. I like it, but I have a lot of work to try and uh, like put reality, a more real perspective on what we can do with it.
Yes, because I've heard this in many companies where they think that they can, reduce the staff count, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's a like an over egging of the whole kind of situation. So how do you manage the expectations of the kind of the management that is kind of at a higher level that see this as a great saver, efficiency kind of producer, and what have you? How do you kind of manage the expectations and get them to come back down to some form of reality?
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because I think there are two main use cases that I see with Gen AI specifically. So we have Gen AI for software development, and I think the great thing of it is that like code is also language, and so large language models are just a natural fit for what we do. So I think that what we're trying to do in that space is to experiment with different tooling, and then we have a community of people that are giving feedback, sharing experiences, and we're doing that as a community, let's say. But we have also a lot of use cases that are not IT related. So I don't know, people in marketing, they want to use whatever Gen AI tool for what they're doing. So I think it's important to have these two areas going on. And what I'm trying to do is to have this adoption in a gradual way, right? So first, we're in this stage where we're experimenting and getting feedback, and I think at that later stage you can get a more concrete feeling of, okay, what is the real efficiency and the real value I can get out of these tools, right? But you cannot just expect them to happen from one day to the other. I think it's a journey.
Yes, I think you're right. Yeah, it's interesting how this story is unfolding, and hopefully we'll get some sanity back into the space around this topic. Great tool, absolutely. I use it quite a lot for various use cases, but it's not the answer to everything. I think, and it's also creating a lot of fear in the space, which I think is a bit unjustified as well. Which, but we have to be kind of more mindful of how it's implemented and our intentions around it. Any other confessions in the space?
Yeah, one interesting confession is like I think when I was let's say more junior, more media software developer, I tend to put a lot of focus on technical skills. I think everyone does that, right? So I think especially relevant with software, right? Technology changes so fast. I mean, every 6 months, the game changed completely. And you need to be always up to date, reading podcasts and understanding what's happening. But as I progressed and as I became a more of a technical manager, a team lead, and then technical manager, I started to value much more people, or some people call soft skills, but and they're really important, right? So I worked as a consultant for ThoughtWorks for almost 10 years there, and I think the good side of being a consultant is that you see many different companies of different sizes, different realities, startups, big companies, and in almost none of these cases, technology was my biggest problem. It it was usually people, right? And how organizations behave. And for example, right, in big companies, you have this classical case of your architecture. It's a consequence of your communication structure and how people interact, and then how you break that to improve your system, right? And then you need a lot of soft skills to do that. You also need a lot of like, I prefer to call people skills, but you need a lot of those to actually make a team, to be like a high performing team. So yeah, I think throughout my career, it's not that I let go the other side. It, of course, is critical to have technical skills, but you cannot ignore the people skills and how the size of the impact they can have.
I'm glad you said that, because this is the stuff that bind these soft skills, these soft activities. These are things that bind an organization, and some of it is quite an art to manage. So it's really good to hear. Do you think there needs to be more training around those aspects of being able to deal with people, and also making people aware of how they show up in teams, and the effect it has on other people? What do you think?
Yes, I think it helps. I received some trainings in the past, and I think it helps you to understand things that you're not doing, or things that you feel that are not important. And yeah, I remember I had trainings around like how to be a tech lead, and later how to be a better manager, or like a, let's say, higher level lead. I think it helps to a certain extent. I also think that different people learn in different ways, right? To me, it was useful, it worked, but to me, it's really important to just connect with peers, right? So, yeah, I think being a leader oftentimes is a very lonely task, and I think the higher you go up in an organization, the lonely can be, the more lonely can be, right? And I think it's important not only to talk to your peers, but also to not try to centralize all the decisions, like empower people to take decisions by themselves, and create this sense of community, right? So yeah, but I think it's important training, but I think it's just part of the equation. Yeah.
Yes, yeah, it's good. And you shared some interesting kind of phrases offline with us earlier on. Do you want to kind of air them here, because I thought they were quite interesting?
Yeah, for sure. So as I told you, I worked for ThoughtWorks for quite some time, and so I work with many people that are famous in the tech industry. So one of them is Martin Fowler, and so one of those sentences we were discussing about is, so he had an article in his website, and he said, you need to be this tall to do microservices. And that's something I always remember, because it's interesting how this space evolved in the past 10, 20 years. So from an engineering perspective, we came from this world what we called service-oriented architecture. So we had this during the 2000s. It was called enterprise service bus. They concentrated all of the API calls of organization there. So it was a very coupled mechanism, and then we started to change to microservices. And I think some people didn't pay attention on the granularity of the services that you had to create. So what I see in many companies still to this day is that people just pay a price that is too high for the autonomy they get with the different services, right? So, for example, many people just want to have more autonomy, so different teams that are doing different services. That's easy. But what is less easy is like how you really decouple these services from each other, right? So it's a careful exercise to understand that you're not changing one thing here and then you have a ripple effect in 2 or 3 other teams, right? And yeah, I think sometimes microservices are just too small or not cut in the right way, and many people just don't put care in this process of designing them, and then you have a much more complex system that you should have because of this.
Yeah, yeah. I can imagine. I guess being an engineer in the past, I'm more focused on what I'm working on right now. I don't really care for the bigger picture or the maintainability or the kind of wider implications. And I guess engineers need to have a big appreciation to know where to cut. I guess this is where architects come in. This is where, system architects are really important, and it is a very important independent role. I know you can roll it into the engineers, but it has an importance of its own, and I think that sometimes gets forgotten.
Of course, and I'm a big fan of doing architecture inside the teams. I don't think teams they can delegate architecture to an external party. I think it has to start from inside the teams. But I think especially in cases where you have many teams and you have like cross team concerns, you need this role of a cross team architect, right? That communicates with all these teams, and then as these things grow naturally, you need, so architecture is something that needs to evolve. It is not fixed, right? So you need to have a group of people thinking on how to evolve these concerns, or how to evolve all these parts that are hard to change, right? Because you cannot do this every day, but you have to always plan with some time in advance. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, I like that actually. It's a little bit like the product owner, but an architect owner. They're not in charge and dictating, but they're holding a space for those discussions and those feedback loops.
Yeah, yeah. To me, it's all about facilitating those discussions. I think the discussions they should start inside the teams. I was always in favor of having tech leads inside the teams, and I remember some funny discussions in the past where people said, especially when you have a team that developers are really senior, they just think, okay, we don't need a tech lead. We are all equals here. We're all good, right? So why bother, right? But at the end of the day, I mean, you don't have teams with the same level of seniority, right? And then if you don't have someone actually owning a little bit of architecture, people management from the technical side, and coding together, all these things, they fall through the cracks, right? So in my experience, it was very beneficial to have someone with that role. Um, and then this person will think about architecture naturally and intentionally, right? And then as you grow with many things, we might have architects on top. But I think it's you need to be intentional about that.
I love that word intentional. It's actually something that I work on quite a lot in the work that I do and with teams, is that um, to have that intentionality, because it also communicates out to the space what you're trying to achieve, but also makes it very clear in your mind what you're going to do, because there's lots of things going on that tend to kind of buffet us and take us and distract us out of the space. So being intentional is a really good anchor to gravitate around.
Absolutely, especially with software development, right? You have like all this pressure coming from different stakeholders. It is a complex job by itself, so you need to carve out time to do these things. Yeah.
And I'm going to bring in another phrase, the other phrase that you mentioned earlier, which made me laugh, and I felt very proud because I've got a particular way around this in the context of this. So you said any fool can write code that a computer can understand. good programmers write code that humans can understand. I love that. Why is that important?
Yeah, it's a problem that you have if even if you're just doing a system yourself. Sometimes this is because of it's a very complex task, so it can be hard even for you to understand what you did like 2 years ago, right? And I think this is much more relevant. We have when I have a team of like say 4, 7, 8 people. So you need to write software in a way that is evolvable, right? I think that the big one of the big problems that we have when we talked about legacy systems earlier is I prefer to have these systems where so you have a team that maintains a product, meaning that's a code that is living, that you're constantly maintaining it. And the best way to maintain it is to write the code in a way that your colleagues can understand and also yourself, right? And if you do that in a good way as team, there's also this when you open the code, you cannot pinpoint who wrote a specific part of code. So if you really do it in a collective way, you have this let's say you have a team opinions there, but yeah, I think it's very important if you want to really evolve your software as you move.
Yeah, on that note, I used to be very, as I mentioned offline, very verbose around the comments around my code. Mostly because I used to forget what I'd written, and I needed to be able to build up my mental models around what I'd implemented, why I'd done whatever, including the variable names being named in a way that was quite verbose, if I'm going to be confessing myself, but I knew what they meant. They kind of created a context and an understanding and an intention. Coming back to the intention word, but often sometimes when there was code that I'd written like years ago and I'd come back to it, I was actually really impressed with it until I realised it actually was my code. I'd completely forgotten that. And I think this is where software engineering is very abstract. It's not like, if you were making a chair and it wasn't a very good chair, you'd look at it and go, that's not a very good made chair. But the software, because it's abstract, it's hard to visualize it and see it. So we have to be a little bit more careful about how we implement it and how we leave it. Just because the user doesn't see the code, it doesn't mean that it's never going to be looked at again. So I think that's a really good shout out.
No, absolutely. I also, I was never a big fan of like heavy documentation. To me, I always liked to have the code documenting itself, being expressive. And if you're a developer, you should be able to read that and understand. And I think that is related to what you said, right? So if you put some care about how you name your variables, or is in the intention behind a function, for example, right? It's these small things, I think they help a lot.
Yeah. Yes. Good. And if I gave you a soapbox to stand on, okay, Speaker's Corner in London. I've never been there myself, but I've heard lots about it. What would you say on that soapbox to the tech community? What would be the topic that you rant on about and throw into the space?
Yeah. What I really enjoy in the role I have is how to make software teams work better, but not only in terms of performance, but also to have a better balance between like work and personal life. So, for example, when I started to work as a developer, I joined this profession because I really like to solve complex problems. It was very interesting for me, and also to know what's possible to do with code in very different fields, right? So it's a lot of power, and you can create a lot of interesting things. But then, in the reality of most organizations, you cannot have that flame burning with the same intensity because you have all this pressure coming from stakeholders. You have these waterfall models with fixed release dates, and then you just have to comply to it. And then when you realize you see no joy anymore in doing code, right? So to me, it's always an interesting exercise to do. Okay, how can we bring this joy back? Not only to developers, but also making sure that you're delivering the expected business value, and the end customer is satisfied. So it's a very tricky balancing exercise, but I think it's a lot to do with engineering practices at the core. So it's interesting. Like, many people talked about the agile movement, and it's a very old thing, right? So more than 20 years has passed, and I had the privilege to work very close with people that created that thing, and it is interesting to see that many people interpreted in many different ways, like the principles of the Agile Manifesto and all these things. But so to me, it's not really about doing ceremonies like you can do like daily meetings, you can do retrospectives, you can do all these things. But to me, it's really about like what are the core engineering practices that you use. So it's really about, okay, how you can. So if it's painful to release something, do it more often, right? And then automate that process. So we talk a lot about continuous integration and continuous delivery in that space. So I think it's important to spend some time to automate the development process itself, the deployment, the releases. In bigger organizations, nowadays it's more common. People invest in what's called developer experience. So you have teams that develop tools for other developers inside the organization, so just to ship code faster with like a better quality. So it's interesting because it's something that many people understand nowadays, especially in more mature organizations. But in smaller organizations and startups, sometimes people confuse agility by lack of discipline, right? I'm really agile. I mean, I you can throw when you work at me. I will shift my priorities and I will deliver. And then when you look at the Jira board, for example, you see, okay, it's a mess. You cannot understand a single thing there. And people usually, they justify themselves. Oh, I don't have time to do that. But you don't have time because you're not putting discipline in this kind of things in first place, right? So I find this very interesting, how to improve teams in this sense. So in my experience, the most like high performance teams that I work with, agility was really invisible because it was all automated. It was just this like a very smooth flow of deployments. It was those teams where, oh, you need to do a release on Friday afternoon. Sure, it is the same thing as doing in any other day because it was all automated. And yeah, I think that that's something that's a really I have a passion for how to improve these things in companies. Yeah.
When you said bring joy back into the work, I 100% believe that. 'Cause I've worked with agile teams which followed ticked box everything that you're supposed to do in agile scrum, and they were lifeless and they were all robotic. It was anything but agile in the end. So maybe they could have added another principle, actually, the 13th principle of bring joy back to the work that we do. Because I'm a big fan of the agile values. I'm a big fan of the agile principles. But what you find is that very often the implementation of agile in whatever form it comes in doesn't actually honor those values and principles in the truest sense. It's kind of bent out of shape. Well, I think it's good people focus on the practices. They think, oh, I'll just do stand-ups. And, I remember speaking to one engineer of another company, and they were saying, I hate stand-ups. And I was like, oh my God, what's going on for you to hate stand-up? He goes, I lose the will to live. I'm literally starting the day and I'm fed up by the end of it. And it turned out that, there was like 20 engineers in the team, and the manager or manageress was going around asking each one for an update, and it was just kind of like,
Yeah, as a very a well-known anti-pattern. Yeah.
yeah, that's a really good point there, anti-pattern. So I think, a call to action to all, leaders, tech leaders out there: bring the joy back into the work, because it can be really joyful. It can be really interesting and very dynamic.
No, of course, and I also think that is not about following like blindly one methodology, right? So, for example, I don't think there's nothing broken with Scrum, but I prefer not to use it because many people that use that, they use it by the book, and I think each team is different. I mean, you need to adapt according to the team you are, the organization you are. And I think you just need to make sure that at the core you have some good practices incorporated, but the details, I mean, you can change. Don't need to be religious about that, right? So yeah, that's
I want to ask you around books and any films or even poems. I always put that in there because someone's actually shared a poem in the past that instrumental in your journey that you'd like to share here to the tech leader audience.
yeah, for sure. I think the first book I remember enjoying as a developer, as a junior developer, let's say, I think was the Pragmatic Programmer by Andy Hans and Dave Thomas. And yeah, what I remember from that book is they talk a lot about this inherent problem of software entropy. So it is a very complex work, and as a developer, you need to fight that every day. And then they give a lot of ideas on how you can fight software entropy. So they talk, for example, about the idea of broken windows. So you have to avoid having broken windows in the code with small things you do here and there. So I think that is yeah, I remember enjoying that book when I read. And I think a most recent book that I read as a manager, it's called The Making of a Manager by Julie Zhu. So she worked at Facebook for many years, and it's a very nice book for new managers, but I think also interesting for existing ones because of the way she framed the let's say the work of a manager. So I think it's what I liked about that book is there's this dilemma sometimes when you're a techie, and many tech people, they say they don't want to become a manager, right? Because I mean, yeah, it's useless work, right? So what are you doing as a manager? You're not coding, right? And I think this book brings some interesting reflections about, okay, isn't management a good thing for you or not, and why? And so I really like that book from that perspective, to actually also understand myself as a manager, and actually understand, okay, that's what I want to do, and that's why. So I think I recommend for yeah, all tech managers and managers in general, I would say.
Yes, fantastic. Thank you for sharing those. I think I've read the Pragmatic Program. I'm not sure. I've read so many books, but this The Making of a Manager seems like a really interesting one. So I'm going to add that to my Himalayan book mountain of books to read. So yeah, I'll add it to the list. So thank you for sharing those. And also now I'm going to offer you a fun question here. The tech genie is in the space, and he's gonna offer you a wish for your industry, for technology. What would you wish for?
I think my wish would be to make um, tech people, I mean, especially inside tech teams, developers, BAs, QAs, and everyone there, to just realize they have way more power that they think when it comes to changing how organization works, right? As I see many people complaining about how hard it is to a certain organization, that is difficult to change the way they work. But I think real change comes from the bottom, and especially when we're in the tech space. And yeah, I think that would be my my first, let's say, wish.
Yeah, we'll have to work on that. I think that's an important one. Important one. And as we come to the final full stop of the podcast together, unfortunately, what would be your key takeaway that you'd leave for tech leaders as a statement, as a gift to them as we part company?
Yeah, I think what can I say? I mean, as a manager, the work itself can be really lonely and daunting at times. And I think the further up you go, the harder it gets, right? So it's different also the fact that when you are an individual contributor, you, especially as a developer, you open a pull request, you commit code, push. There's this instant gratification that you don't get as tech manager. It's much more indirect. So you need to adjust, right, on how to work with that. So I think it's important as a manager to just talk to people that are in a similar position as you, but also try to build a community and of people that can support you inside the company, right? I try to delegate decisions and empower people to take decisions as much as possible. So I think that in software is really important to have autonomous teams as much as possible. So yes, I would say try to connect with people on both directions, right? So on peers, but also uh, people that might be reporting to you. They can work with you to a great extent. Um, I also think that as leaders, it's very important to to show which changes you want to see in the organization. As an example, so I think for us, it's important to reinforce the behaviors we want to see, but also to flag which ones we think it's inappropriate. And I think culture is about that. I think it's if you want to have a change in your engineering culture, you need to do these things constantly. Of course, there's communication, there's change management involved, but I think as leaders, this is really important. You need to be this example, right? Um, Something that I also think it's good is do not avoid hard conversations. They are really important, and sometimes they're really awkward, and you might get a bad feeling when they happen. But they are really important, and usually it's a sign that things are actually changing. What's good. Um, so yeah, and I think the last one is just like feedback is really important, not only for you as a leader, but for your peers, the people reporting to you. So yeah, try to also embrace this feedback culture if possible.
Brilliant. I think every single one of those that you shared there, I would love to have a wider conversation because they are really important statements you make there. But maybe we can do that over a beer or a beverage sometime, you know? So thank you for sharing them. They were brilliant. It's been wonderful having you on CISO Confessions.